On the day after the Brazilian race, it was Oscars night, as the 65th Academy Awards took place, hosted for the fourth year running by Billy Crystal. The big winner of the night was Clint Eastwood's western Unforgiven, with 4 wins from 9 nominations: Best Picture, Best Director for Eastwood, Best Supporting Actor for Gene Hackman, and Best Film Editing for Joel Cox. The Merchant Ivory costume drama Howard's End was also nominated in 9 categories and won 3: Emma Thompson for Best Actress, Ruth Prawer-Jabvala for Best Adapted Screenplay, and Luciana Origi and Ian Whittaker for Best Art Direction. The other major awards were won by Al Pacino for Best Actor in Centre for Woman, Marissa Tomei for Best Supporting Actress in My Cousin Vinny, and Best Original Screenplay for Neil Jordan for The Crying Game, the only award that film received from its 6 nominations. Britain's most famous horse race, the Grand National, was staged as usual in early April at Aintree Racecourse, home of the British Grand Prix in the late 50s and early 60s, but there was a problem with the starting tape, and there was a false start. At the restart, there was again a problem with the tape, which this time got wrapped around jockey Richard Dunwoody's neck, but this time the red flag waved to signal a restart didn't unfurl properly and wasn't seen by 30 of the 39 riders who'd charged off at full tilt. Several pulled up during the course of the first lap as they realised what had happened, and a few others fell, so only 7 actually finished the race, with Isha Ness of 50-1 shot crossing the line first. But the race was declared void, and for the first time since it began in 1839, there would be no winner. The bookies were estimated to be out some £75 million in refunded bets, the poor lambs, and the Jockey Club ordered an investigation. And the first ever qualifying session for the Eurovision Song Contest was held in Ljubljana. With an increasing number of national broadcasters now joining the European Broadcasting Union in the post-Cold War era, the EBU had increased the number of slots in the competition from 20 to 25, but with anything up to 14 new countries wanting to join in, a qualifying competition was organised. In the event, just 7 entered, with 3 able to proceed to the main event, and after the juries had voted, those 3 would be the delegations from Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, with the losing 4, Slovakia, Estonia, Hungary and Romania, being guaranteed entry to the 1994 contest, as the lowest scoring countries at this year's competition were relegated. And so, over Easter weekend, the attention of the F1 world turned for the first time to Leicestershire. Donington Hall, a rather handsome late 18th century country pile near the village of Castle Donington, had served as a POW camp during the First World War, which incidentally saw the only successful escape of a German from a British POW camp during either World War, Günther Plüschow, naval pilot and explorer, whose wiki page is well worth a read. After the war, the family allowed Fred Craner to use some of the estate roads for motorcycle racing, which he then turned into a permanent circuit in 1933, and car racing also began. The first Donington Grand Prix, a 300-mile endurance race, took place in 1935 and was won by Richard Mad Jack Shuttleworth in his Alfa P3, and by 1937 the track had made it onto the European Tour, the inaugural event dominated by the Silver Arrows, with Bernd Rosemeyer in his Auto Union leading home the Mercedes of Manfred von Brauchitsch and Rudi Caracciola. 1938 was more of the same, with Nuvolari's Auto Union winning ahead of Hermann Lang and Richard Seaman in the Mercedes, though at least this time a couple of the British-era cars at least finished. War intervened again, then the house was used to house refugees for a while, and the circuit began to fall into disrepair. In 1971, the house and grounds were bought by local classic car collector and businessman Tom Wheatcroft, who had been in attendance at those 30s races as a boy. He began to invest in reconstructing the circuit, running his own racing team in junior formulae, and sponsoring drivers into F1. It was Wheatcroft who'd sponsored Roger Williamson in 1973 and was devastated when he was killed at the Dutch Grand Prix that year. He turned his car collection into a museum, the Donington Grand Prix collection, which, side note, I will never forgive myself for not quite getting round to going and visiting despite driving right past it for 15 years before it closed its doors for good in 2018. And Wheatcroft began to campaign to bring F1 back to Donington. Teams came and tested there, and it looked like it might happen in 1988, but it fell through, and attempts to hold an Irish Grand Prix there were blocked by the RAC. A little dogleg with a hairpin at Melbourne was added to bring the track up to regulation length, now 2.5 miles, just over 4 kilometres. And finally, when the plans for an Asian Grand Prix in Japan fell through, Wheatcroft had his opportunity, as Bernie Eccleston was keen to put a shot across the bows of Silverstone owners, the British Racing Drivers Club, and remind them that he had other options in Britain, especially as there was an ongoing legal case between Bernie's friend Tom Walkinshaw and the BRDC. On the subject of ongoing sagas, Ayrton Senna still hadn't come to an agreement with Ron Dennis. Ron was keen to emphasise to Ford that Senna's win in Brazil demonstrated that his car had the quality to win races regularly if they just gave him that 8th-generation engine the Benettons had, but Senna, his agenda slightly different, was busy disclaiming that he'd only really won because of the rain and Prost's misfortune and that he still wasn't happy with the car. So for now, it was another one-off deal, another $750k paycheck, and we'll see how we feel later. He would at least have some pleasant memories of Donington Park. A decade earlier, in 1983, he'd driven his first laps in an F1 car here for Frank Williams at a private test. Benetton themselves, meanwhile, were debuting their new car at Donington. The new B193B was visually identical to the stopgap B193A, the differences being mostly under the skin, much as Ross Brawn protested that it was a, quote, completely new car, end quote, though it had sprouted 2 of those barge boards that McLaren had used in South Africa. Another new car at Donington was the new Footwork FA14, with aerodynamics designed by Alan Jenkins in the team's wind tunnel, as well as ABS brakes and a semi-automatic gearbox hooked up to Mugen's new MF351HB engine. No more powerful, but lighter than its predecessor and with a lower centre of gravity. Tyrrell's Yamajerd engine also had an upgrade, with pneumatic distribution and redesigned oil pump and pistons, but an unimpressed Ken Tyrrell pointed out that this version was supposed to have been debuted back in Kyalami. In any case, the new 021 chassis was nearly ready, and it was hoped it could be introduced at Imola. After 2 disastrous races, Jordan parted company with Ivan Capelli by mutual consent. The Italian had, it seemed, had his confidence so shattered by his annus horribilis at Ferrari that his crash in South Africa and DNQ in Brazil had been the last straw. Sources vary as to whether he quit or was fired, but in either case, it was over. So as one veteran's career seemed to have ended, another got a reprieve as Thierry Boutsen, who had been in talks with Eddie in the off-season, arrived to fill in. Boutsen had endured 2 rough seasons at a Ligier team in transition, and even the famously good-natured Belgian had struggled to maintain his easygoing nature as the relationships with both team owner Guy Ligier and upstart teammate Eric Comas had fractured. With no offers on the table for 1993, it was widely assumed that Thierry's F1 career had come to a natural if unceremonious end. He still had backing from Barclay Tobacco and had actually been in attendance at the Phoenix IndyCar race to see if there were any takers there, but when he returned home, there was a message asking him if he was available to race in Donington next weekend. Ferrari had a new signing too, with Peugeot's announcement the week before the race that it was officially abandoning its Works team project. Jean Todt had signed up instead with Maranello. Not everyone was pleased. Harvey Postlethwaite's job wasn't looking quite as secure as it had been, and he opined that what Ferrari needed was a bit of stability. In any case, they were marking an unwanted record, 37 races without a win since Alain Prost's victory at Jerez in 1990. And Michael Andretti, who hadn't had the dream start to his F1 career, greeted his dad, fresh from victory in the Valvoline 200 at Phoenix, who'd come to give him a few pointers and a bit of encouragement. Andretti Sr.'s new teammate, Nigel Mansell, had not enjoyed his first experience of oval racing, crashing hard in practice and having to withdraw after straining his back. If he was able to race next time round, he would be on familiar ground at Long Beach, which he'd driven over a decade earlier when it was a round of the F1 calendar in the early 80s. At 53, Mario Andretti had become the oldest driver ever to win in IndyCar, and he was followed home by fellow F1 alumnus Raoul Boesel, with Jimmy Vasser third, his first podium placing in just his 13th Indy race. With Williams' new sponsor Sega having stumped up some cash to get the race going, and plastered the logo all over the track, and McLaren responding by putting a Sonic the Hedgehog splattered by a tyre mark as a kill marking on the side of Senna's cars, the cars took to the tarmac on Thursday for a familiarisation session under clear skies, but by the time qualifying started on Good Friday, the rain had rolled in and shook things up rather. Senna was fastest by just 300ths over Hill, followed by Prost, Leto 4th and the Ferraris 5th and 6th, but on Saturday the sun came back out again and made the previous day's times irrelevant. Normal service was resumed, with Prost maintaining his 100% pole record for the year, with Hill joining him on the front row just as in Brazil. Schumacher was third, but over 1.5 seconds off pole, with Senna over a tenth behind the Benetton in an unhappy fourth, having not got his dry weather settings quite right. Michael Andretti was sixth, a respectable 6/10 behind Senna, but in fifth was the excellent Karl Wendlinger, with Leto seventh, making it Sauber's best qualifying in their short but impressive history so far. After more troubles with their active suspension, the problem seemed to be the inconsistent oil pressure, the Ferraris could only manage 8th and 9th, 2.5 seconds off pole, with Patrese 10th after suffering an electronic failure and being unable to do better. He had professed that all he wanted at Donington was to finish, having failed to do so far. Herbert and Zanardi were 11th and 13th, split by Rubens Barrichello in his best grid spot yet, while the new footwork looked good in the hands of Warwick, 14th, but Suzuki had the lion's share of the gearbox teething troubles and ended up just 23rd. The new Tyrrell engine didn't help a lot, with De Cesaris having a big off on Friday morning and having to qualify in Katayama's car. He just scraped onto the grid, while Ukio himself was a more encouraging 18th. Boutsen was 19th, finding himself too tall for the Jordan 193, while the Brundle brothers found the Ligier practically undrivable here and couldn't do better than row 11. When the dust had settled, it was rookie Luca Badoa who missed out at Donington, about 3/10 off his teammate. Easter Sunday dawned wet, and Hill pleased the home crowd by going fastest in the warm-up, while the rest tinkered with their settings. There was another shower just after lunch, and as the spectators huddled under their umbrellas, with everyone's attention on Princess Diana walking the grid as her messy divorce from Prince Charles dominated the headlines. Everyone would start on wet tyres except for Alboreto, who had nothing really to lose and hoped he could keep it on the black bit until it dried out and everyone else had to pit. Leto failed to get away for the parade lap with an ignition problem and would start from the pit lane in the spare, also slick-shod for the same reason. The red lights went green and everyone gingerly put their foot down, Prost and Hill keeping the top two spots, while Schumacher moved over to keep Senna behind him, allowing Wendlinger past both of them and up into third. Senna then went on a charge, passing Schumacher at the Craner curves, then going round the outside of Wendlinger at the old hairpin. He got into Hill's slipstream as Damon was feeling out the conditions and went up the inside at McLean's to go second. Behind them, Andretti was also going well and had got ahead of Schumacher, only to trip over Wendlinger, putting both out. Barrichello and Alesi also came steaming past Schumacher, who was running dry weather aero settings, as Senna went inside Prost at the Melbourne hairpin to finish the first lap in the lead, a stunning drive that would be labelled the lap of the gods. So Senna led from Prost, Hill, Barrichello, Alesi, Schumacher, Berger, Herbert, Patrese and Zanardi in the top 10. Now all he had to do was stay there for another 75 laps. Senna quickly pulled away. The rain had stopped and the track would begin to dry quickly, so Ayrton was keen to put as much distance between himself and the Williamses as possible before their greater horsepower could make itself felt. The McLaren was 6 seconds ahead by the end of lap 3, while Hill was beginning to come under threat from a flying Barrichello, and Suzuki dropped back with a spin. The sky remained grim and overcast, but the rain continued to hold off, and a dry line was starting to emerge, with some of the back markers coming in early to try and steal an advantage, first Katayama and then Brundle, who nearly tripped over Comas when he emerged. A couple of laps later, Martin lost it under braking for the S's at the start of the Melbourne hairpin complex and stalled, leaving his car in a rather awkward spot for the marshals to remove. Barrichello was still running well, keeping a flu-ridden Alesi and a dry set-up Schumacher behind him, the lot of them lapping Leto as he tried to recover from having to start from the pit lane. Herbert was in for slicks on lap 10, as everyone waited to see when the leaders would make the change. Senna was a bit cautious in the traffic, which allowed Prost to close to within 3.5 seconds, but the Professor was then stymied by Zanardi, who'd just come out on cold slicks, allowing the gap to increase back to 6 seconds, and leading Damon Hill to have a look at getting past 2. Prost was having none of it. Berger came in from 7th, but there was a problem on his stop and he was stationary for 20 seconds, which wouldn't help his cause as he was struggling with a gas pressure problem on his shock dampers. Alesi was in next and only lost 1 place to Schumacher, while Leto found the spare Sauber, set up for the much taller Wendlinger, undrivable and pulled in to retire. Another promising qualifying with no reward for the Swiss newcomers. Senna came in on lap 18, getting out between Prost and Hill, who'd stopped a lap earlier off-screen, so Prost led on a drying track as he lapped his one-time title rival Michele Alboreto before coming in on lap 19, a quick stop getting him out second just behind Senna, with pretty much everyone now on slicks. Senna led Prost, Hill, Alesi, Barrichello and Schumacher in the top 6, with Herbert, Patrese, Alio and Barbazza making up the top 10. The Italian Minardi driver had been notably faster than his teammate Fittipaldi in the wet on Friday, but slower in the dry qualifying on Saturday. Berger's day was over with a hydraulic fluid leak on lap 20, but just around then it started to drizzle again, which made the surface very treacherous. On lap 22, Prost was in to put wet tyres back on and return to the track 5th, while Schumacher seemed to underline that it had been a good decision by spinning off and getting beached in the gravel. The McLaren team were ready with groove tyres for Senna, but he was staying out, adept at driving on such slippery conditions. Barrichello also stopped, dropping behind Alesi, who was promoted to second when Hill came in on lap 25 as the rain started coming down properly. Hill's stop was a good one, putting him out behind Prost, while Patrese also pitted, nearly collecting Senna as he emerged, while Prost had now arrived on the tail of the still slick-shod Barrichello. The young Brazilian can't have expected to have been racing with Alain Prost for a podium position in just his 3rd Grand Prix, and just his 5th year after leaving karting, and it didn't last long, but he certainly acquitted himself well in the tricky conditions. As the rain continued to fall, Senna finally stopped on lap 28, just as the ESPN were on an ad break, emerging still in the lead, while Barrichello also stopped, promoting Hill back to 3rd. De Cesaris had an attack of his old habits, making an ambitious move to unlap himself from 6th-placed Alio, slipping on the offline water and tipping both of them into a spin. Andrea got moving again, but Philippe had stalled his engine and was out of a very promising position and stuck in the same very awkward spot as Brundle had been in earlier, just as Alesi and Prost came past amidst a group of backmarkers. As half-distance approached, Alesi came in for wets, only for the rear jack to drop him before the tyres were quite done and hold him up, getting back out 5th. Barrichello was going great guns once more, catching Hill as the second Williams was hampered by Warwick and Fittipaldi and went inside at the Melbourne hairpin on lap 32, rather obscured by an on-screen graphic. It stopped raining again and the mechanics wearily got out the slicks again. Prost came in on lap 34, a 7-second stop, getting him out still in second, and then Senna came in next time around, but a problem with the right rear wheel nut kept him stationary for 20 seconds and lost him the lead as Hill stopped too. All of which gave Prost a 7-second lead, but then it started raining again. Alesi came in for wets, but also had a wheel problem and was held up, getting out behind Herbert. He only did a lap or two before retiring with the same issue as Berger. Prost was back in for stop number 4 on lap 39 to put on wet tyres, followed by Barrichello and Zanardi, which put Senna back in the lead just after halfway. But it wasn't raining evenly across the track, and there were dry and wet patches, and so on lap 40, Senna led Prost by 16.6 seconds, with Hill about the same distance again behind in 3rd, then Barrichello, Herbert and Patrese. Damon followed his teammate on lap 42 to put on groove tyres, dropping back behind Barrichello again, while a charging Barbazza got past Warwick into 7th place. Senna seemed completely in control on his slick tyres, giving Johnny Herbert a shake of the fist as he lapped him, feeling the Lotus driver had balked him, and at that point the rain stopped again, with Senna already 21 seconds ahead of Prost and lapping 2 seconds quicker. Prost, realising that he could actually have stayed out on slicks, came in to rectify that, stop number 5, only to stall on the getaway thanks to his traction control and get stuck in gear. After 40 seconds stationary, he got going again, now 4th, with Barrichello and Hill past, and a lap down on Senna, who came past just as Prost exited the pits. Hill also came in a couple of laps later to do the same, emerging behind as team leader. So now it was Senna leading Barrichello by 1 minute and 12 seconds, the only two on the lead lap. The Jordan team were casting anxious glances, first at Rubinho's grooved tyre temperatures, which were rising on the drying track, then at what looked suspiciously like an approaching storm cloud. Prost, for his part, felt a drop in tyre pressure and moved over to let Hill through to chase Barrichello, who still just about had time to make a stop without losing his place, but not for much longer. And Prost made stop number 6, assuming he had a puncher, to change to a new set of slicks. The storm cloud arrived, lap number 55, and another downpour began as Senna arrived behind Barrichello to put a lap on his young protégé and have lapped the whole field by 2/3 distance. Unfortunately, Barrichello still thought Senna must be up ahead of him somewhere, and therefore this must be for position, and spent some time jinking around in front of Ayrton to defend his place before succumbing. Then, responding to the Jordan team's pit messages, he came in for a set of slicks. A lovely stop, but the heavens opened just as he set off on his new dry tyres, and Hill set fastest lap as he passed Rubens in the pits to regain second place. Senna decided to come in for wets but changed his mind at the last second, so drove straight through and kept going. And just as well, because the rain eased off again as soon as it had started. Senna stayed out another lap to see how it would develop, securely a full lap ahead of everyone else and able to take it as easy as he liked. Further back, Warwick had made his way up to 6th in the new footwork, sporting an extra deck of rear wing for more grip on the twisty track, while Barbazza had dropped back behind Prix as he tried to husband the Minardi's tyres. Hill was closing in on Senna with 14 laps to go, while Prost was now 18 seconds behind his teammate. The rain may have stopped, but the conditions were still treacherous, catching out both Zanardi and Fittipaldi within seconds of each other, but both got moving again. Lap 66 of 76, and as Hill unlapped himself from Senna into turn 1, the heavens opened yet again, and this time Senna made a quick call to change to wets. He could have climbed out of the cockpit and had a bit of Easter egg and still been back out on track in the lead, while James Allen in the pits talked to Eddie Jordan about his team's great race, both apparently oblivious to Thierry Boutson's car being wheeled into the garage behind them with a seized accelerator. Senna was taking it easy, as well he could, while Warwick lost 6th after his gearbox gave up and he parked in front of the pits, the second time in 3 races he'd been denied a point. As the rain continued to fall, Hill was back in for stop number 4, having to avoid an errant photographer, back out still in a comfortable second place, while teammate Prost was now just 12 seconds ahead of Barrichello, who'd already switched to wets. Senna allowed Hill to catch up and unlap himself again, as Prost made stop number 7 to put on wet tyres, getting out in 4th behind Rubinho's Jordan. With just 6 laps to go, Herbert had a spin and got himself going again, all without losing his 5th place, with Patrese and Barbazza still some way up the road scrapping for 6th. Sadly, Rubens Barrichello's heroics were ended with just 4 laps to go when his fuel pressure dropped. As a heartbroken Rubinho climbed out, Barbazza celebrated inheriting 6th by passing Patrese, only to spin. Like Herbert, he was able to recover without losing 6th. And Zanardi went by, unlapping himself from them and recovering from an excursion into the gravel and spreading the stuff all over the track. Hill, who'd collided with Zanardi in South Africa, gingerly got past as Senna began his last lap as the rain continued lashing down. Senna took his 2nd win of the year and the 38th of his career, and the 240th all-time podium for McLaren. He pulled over to request a flag as usual, something that took a surprising amount of gesticulation to convey, only to drop it as soon as he got going again. Hill came in 2nd, with Prost 3rd and a lap down. Senna making his way back to the Parc Ferme with the Brazilian flag wrapped around his rear suspension, which he retrieved to take the podium. Johnny Herbert finished a fine 4th after only stopping once all afternoon, with Patrese satisfied with not only his first Benetton finish but 2 points to boot, even if he was 2 laps down, with Barbazza scoring his first career point in F1 and Minardi's 2nd scoring finish of the year. He beat Christian Fittipaldi, who finished 7th, with Zanardi and Comas both 4 laps adrift, Barrichello classified 10th, and Alboreto soldiering on to finish 6 laps down. It had been a devastating win for Senna, after possibly the best drive of his long career. Not only had he finished a full lap ahead of his old rival Prost, but he had extended his championship lead to 12 points in the process. Not something he or anyone else would have predicted at the start of the season. The Brazilian was handed a Sonic-shaped trophy by Tom Walkinshaw as a photo op, as the Sega execs smiled through gritted teeth, before getting the real thing. The Sonic trophy spent some time in the storeroom at Woking before finally being dug out and put on display in 2010. Prost at least managed a wan smile as he raised the 3rd-place trophy, shook Senna's hand, and the traditional champagne spraying took place to the strains of the European anthem, Ode to Joy. Off mic before the press conference as the drivers were chatting, Prost was bemoaning the litany of technical problems he'd had in the race, to which Senna interrupted to say, "You know, any time you want to swap cars." But when asked by James Allen about his future with McLaren, his buoyant mood evaporated.
Does this now mean that your continuation with McLaren is assured?
I'll make no comment about that. We talk so much about this thing, and I don't feel particularly good. I don't see any good things coming out of those discussions.